Good morning. Welcome to the first ever NIADA Virtual National Policy Conference. We're grateful that you would spend some time with us. We certainly wish we had the opportunity to be with you in person in Washington, D.C., but unfortunately, circumstances do not allow us to do that this year. But nevertheless, we are still actively engaged in policy opportunities and policy discussions, and we feel it's important to engage you all in what we've been doing over the course of the last several months, certainly through the pandemic, and what we anticipate happening moving forward. So during the course of our time together this morning, you'll have the opportunity to hear not only from us at NIADA and what we're working on and what we're doing, but have the opportunity to hear from some of the policymakers themselves. Later on, we'll have a guest presenter from the Federal Trade Commission, and we'll also hear from some of my colleagues at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce about the impact of the election on small business. And we have the opportunity to engage with Senator John Thune. That is an NIADA PAC event. If you'd like for more information on how to participate in that event, you can go to the policy conference website, niadapolicyconference.com, and you can get some information on how you can participate in that wonderful roundtable discussion with Senator Thune. We're going to kick off our policy conference this morning with a brief update on what NIADA has been working on with our government affairs efforts. Glad to be joined by Sante Esposito. Many of you know Sante. He's been with NIADA as a consultant for the better part of a decade now, I think a little over a decade now. And Sante's done a fantastic job for us, not only on Capitol Hill, but in the administration and some of the agencies that touch us as well. So glad to be joined by Sante this morning. Let me start off by talking about the beginning of the year and where we were at prior to the pandemic and some of the top policy issues that we were working on. And certainly these are things that are still there, but things changed as we hit March and COVID-19 became a reality for all of us. Here over the course of the past several years, there have been several key issues that continue to pop up. At the forefront of that is used motor vehicle recalls and the continued effort by some in Congress to implement legislation that would prohibit you from selling a vehicle with any open recall. That issue continues to percolate under the surface. We'll talk about what that looks like in the future here a little bit later in our discussion today, but want you to be aware that that's certainly something that we started the year as a top priority. We also had on our radar screen data privacy. There was a big push by both Republicans and Democrats to implement some privacy legislation and there were lots of different plans, lots of different discussion points going around, but we continue to watch that, and it really culminated in a rule that the Federal Trade Commission proposed, an update to the safeguards rule, to which NIADA commented. In that proposal, the FTC had several what we perceive to be pretty draconian requirements that took away what we believe took away the flexibility of developing a safeguards identity theft protection program plan and some of the other safeguards and taking away the flexibility that small business owners and small businesses could develop a plan that works for them and put very specific requirements on. We've been working with the Federal Trade Commission on that issue for the past a little over a year now, including having one of our great dealers, McCloskey Motors, participate in a panel discussion with the Federal Trade Commission about the rule and some of the impacts to small business. That panel discussion took place earlier this year, and I think was very well received. But as we shifted into March, it became very evident that there were a couple of key things that needed to happen. Once the pandemic hit, fear, as you all know, I think grabbed hold of everybody. Fear of what the what the disease would look like, fear of what it's going to do to the economy, fear of what it's going to do to our businesses. And as a result of that fear, we started to see several governments impose pretty strict lockdowns. You all know that, we heard flatten the curve, we heard social distancing, we heard new normal, we heard all these terms that we never contemplated before. And we started to see local, county, city, and state governments impose these lockdowns, shut down businesses, and then deem what they considered to be essential businesses or essential business operations, depending on what they felt were essential critical services needed to be delivered to the citizenry at a time when this pandemic was raging at its what was believed to be its highest point. Once those happened, we set out at NIADA to work with our state, local associations to disseminate information to governors, to mayors, to county commissioners, hoping that they would realize and understand the vital impact that automotive retail sales and service had on the economy, particularly for those people that were in other essential businesses, other businesses like healthcare workers, grocery store workers, other transportation industries that were working on supply chains. One of the things that we did was send a letter to the National Governors Association and Municipal League associations, encouraging them to formally deem automotive retail sales and service as an essential business. The federal government also got involved in this concept of what is and what is not what is and what is not an essential business. The Department of Homeland Security, through one of their internal divisions, worked on a list of critical essential businesses. There were several iterations of that list, the initial one of which did not include automotive retail sales. Automotive service was included. So we went to work in working with the administration. We wrote a letter to the president. We had multiple conversations with the Department of Homeland Security, with folks in the White House, with key allies on the Hill, to make sure that they understood how important it was that automotive retail sales remain open. We actually heard several stories from dealers across the country that they had customers that were other essential businesses that got into accidents, and it was cheaper to buy a new car than repair a car, and they couldn't sell them a car because they were otherwise shut down. So after several attempts and several discussions and several letters and several conversations, ultimately the administration saw our point of view and changed that essential business document to include automotive retail sales and service. So that percolated throughout the country, and we're now at a point through those efforts that sales, as you know, have been booming over the course of the pandemic. But that's one of the most important things we set out to do. The second thing that we set out to do at the outset of the pandemic was we recognized pretty early on in conversations with our dealers across the country that funds to continue to operate as a small business were going to be needed, whether additional capital or government assistance or loans from banks. Those were going to be critical as businesses were shut down, as people were going to be forced to be furloughed. All of these ideas of making funds available to keep people on the payroll became a central theme in what we were doing, but certainly we weren't the only ones. Let me bring Sante in to talk a little bit about this massive stimulus bill that went through Congress called the CARES Act and the PPP program. Sante, I'll let you take that away.
Thank you, Shaun, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the policy conference. The CARES Act is one of 5 COVID legislative initiatives. Of the 5, 2 have become law. and 3 are pending in Congress. The one that became law in addition to the CARES Act is the Paycheck Protection Program Act. The 3 in Congress, which are pending on the House side, are 2 bills which have the same name, the HEROES Act, version 1, version 2, and on the Senate side, the HEALS Act. So the CARES Act was enacted in March, and that bill was an omnibus bill providing over $3 trillion, various aspects of the society and the economy to address the COVID situation, money to state and local governments, money for transportation modes, money for hospitals and health practitioners, individual checks to folks, and increase in unemployment comp and extension of the program. But one of the inclusions in that act, as Shaun mentioned, is the PPP program. And that program, the act provided $400 billion for small businesses in the form of loans and grants. And it defined small businesses as those that had less than 500 employees. And the way the program worked is it put a $10 million cap on individual loans. And it said that if small businesses spent the funds that had been loaned to them within 8 weeks on required eligible activities, then they didn't have to repay the funds, that they were forgiven for having to repay those funds. One of the required activities was that at least 75% of the funds that were received by a particular business had to be spent on payroll costs. So that was in March. In June, the PPP Flexibility Act became law, and it was a direct response to concerns that had come to the attention of Congress and others about the initial program in the CARES Act. And basically that program made 3 changes. It increased from 8 weeks to 24 weeks, the time by which small businesses had to spend the money. It reduced the 75% payroll cost requirement to 60%, and it extended the PPP program until the end of December of this year. Under the CARES Act, the program is supposed to expire in August. So those are the 2 laws that are on the books. Now, between March and June, the House, on primarily a partisan basis, passed the first version of the HEROES Act. At that time, they didn't put any more money into the program because the CARES Act had just become law and they wanted to see how that would play out. But what they did is they proposed in that piece of legislation to eliminate the 75% requirement, to extend from 8 to 24 weeks, and to extend the program to the end of the year. Subsequent to that, in July, the Senate responded to the House first version of the HEROES Act by introducing the HEALS Act. Now, I say introducing because no further action has been taken on the Senate bill. And on the first version of the HEROES Act, the Senate has not considered it at all. But the Senate's bill, called the HEALS Act, provides $190 billion more into the program. However, it specifies that small businesses with 300 employees or less would be eligible. So it moves from the 500 to the 300, puts a cap of $2 million per loan and extends the program to the end of the year, and also streamlines the forgiveness process. The forgiveness process has been an area of contention. It's been determined to be very cumbersome, very difficult, and up until recently, none of the loans have been forgiven from the CARES Act just because of that. So they're trying to deal with how they can streamline that process. So that was in July. Just last week, the House passed another version of the HEROES Act called HEROES 2.0. And that's a scaled down version of what they passed in the springtime. And basically that would put $30 billion into the program, and it would extend the termination date to the end of the year, the 8 weeks to the 24 weeks. It would eliminate the 75% completely. Now, you've all seen the reports in the paper. As of this point, negotiations are ongoing, being led by, on the Democratic side by the Speaker and on the Republican side by the Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin. Whether or not we'll see a second round is still not clear because those deliberations have been ongoing for weeks. Sometimes they seem to be more productive than other times. And sometimes, they think they're close to resolution when they're not. So we'll just have to see. And it's not necessarily going to follow that what was in HEROES 2 and the Senate HEALS bill are going to be what we see at the end of the day. And again, there's a bigger picture here. It's not just the PPP, which is at issue in these deliberations. It's the whole ball of wax. It's how much. For example, the Speaker has been saying that their overall package that they could support would be somewhere around $2.4 trillion. The Senate Republicans are saying about $1.4, $1.5 trillion. They can come together on the numbers and then beyond the numbers on the specifics. So that's where things stand at this point with respect to whether or not we see a second round of the CARES Act.
So some of the other things, PPP, we've been working on, at the outset, we believe that buy here, pay here dealers that had their own separate related finance company would be eligible for PPP funds as well. The Small Business Administration took a different position. We have been working with a coalition of other financial industries that have similar but unrelated, pardon the pun, businesses to convince Congress that our interpretation of the CARES Act, that those related finance companies would be eligible. We're still waiting and trying to get some specific determination from Congress to include them in the next bill. We've also been working, to Sante's point, on a bill that would make loan forgiveness in essence automatic for loans that are $150,000 or less. Also working to clear up the issue of tax deductibility of those expenses where you're using PPP funds to cover them, whether or not the use of the PPP funds makes that expense tax deductible. So stay tuned for that. We'll continue to update everyone on that. But Sante, let me ask you this. Certainly, traditionally, Congress would recess in October and especially in an election year and go back and campaign and get ready for the first Tuesday in November. What does the congressional schedule look like between now and the end of the year?
So currently, Congress is in recess. Technically, the House is in recess until November 16th. The Senate's in recess until October 19th. But both recesses are subject to the call of the chair. Should there be a second round of the CARES Act and a vote, members would likely be called back. And of course, in addition to that, the Senate has to deal with the situation of the nomination of the Supreme Court Justice. And at this point, the vote for that is being targeted around October 29th. In addition to that, Congress passed a continuing resolution, which we'll talk about perhaps later on, and that funded the government until December 11th. So there will be a lame duck session. So Congress will be coming back after the election. And how long they stay and whether they get it done by December 11th or another extension of the funding is yet to be seen. But this, come the end of the year, is the end of this session. So any piece of legislation that's out there that's pending that is not that does not get enacted into law by the end of this session dies, and everything has to start off anew in the new Congress.
So speaking of the continuing resolution, maybe you can explain what that means and what impact that continuing resolution will have, particularly on stimulus discussions.
So by law, Congress is supposed to pass all the appropriation bills by October 1. That seldom gets done just because of the politics of the process. And it didn't happen this year. The House passed all of the appropriation bills. The Senate passed none. And so they had to deal with the issue of how do you continue funding the government beyond October 1. And what they do is they pass a continuing resolution so they can buy some time to hopefully reach agreement on the individual appropriation bills. So the continuing resolution that was passed this year extends funding until December 11th. So it basically is funding the federal government at last year's fiscal year level prorated to December 11th. All indications are that come December 11th, they're not going to pass the appropriation bills. There's just too many and there's so many differences. So they're going to have to do another continuing resolution, which they happen to do as a matter of practice, unfortunately, the past few Congresses. So it'll be a continuing resolution that will probably go to the end of December to buy a little bit more time this year, or it'll spill over till next year, sometime in February and March. In the initial deliberations of the continuing resolution before they reached agreement on December 11th, the White House was pushing for the middle of December. The House Democrats were pushing for the middle of March. The significance of the continuing resolution this time around are twofold. Number one, it guarantees a lame duck session, which again presents opportunities to do things in the last minute of a Congress where a lot of members are scrambling to get things done because, like I said, if it doesn't happen now, it's going to be starting from the beginning next year. The second thing that this continuing resolution did, notwithstanding the fact that it only extends to December 11th, it reauthorized the highway program for 1 year. Why is that relevant to the association? Because that's one of the pieces of legislation that we had been monitoring as a possible vehicle for the inclusion of industry-related legislation, whether we support it or not. But that's not going to happen, at least in the lame duck session with the highway bill, because that has been extended until September 30th of next year.
So the lame duck, for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, talks about, the legislature coming back after an election. So Sante, let me talk to you a little bit about, or ask you a little bit about different scenarios. So what would you envision a lame duck session looking like with a Trump win and a Senate that continues to be Republican after the election? On the flip side, what would happen if things are different, if a Biden win and the Senate flips?
So the lame duck session is going to be entirely driven by the results of the election. If the president wins re-election and the Senate stays Republican, then it'll be business as usual. Members will move ahead on legislation that's pending and try to reach the point of enactment before the end of the session. If, however, Vice President Biden wins and the Senate flips to Democrats, then our guess is that most of the legislation will spill over until next year into the new Congress, when the Democrats believe that the outcome will be more favorable to them. If it turns out to be a hybrid, the president wins, but the Senate flips to Democratic, or the vice president wins and the Republicans hold on to the Senate, then in talking to folks on the Hill, it's everyone's best guess as to what's going to happen at that point, and we shall see.
The wild, wild west moves to Washington, D.C., it sounds like.
Amen.
What do we anticipate happening in the next Congress? Well, let me back up and ask, what's the likelihood of a stimulus bill being passed between now and the election? And then if not, what's the likelihood of that taking place in a lame duck session, one way or the other?
Between now and the election, no chance at all. In a lame duck session, again, it'll depend on, the results of the election, on who's in control or who will become in control. And also there's an inherent reluctance in Congress to pass between an election and a new Congress major legislation, because number one, you're having members voting on a major piece of legislation who are not going to be here in the next Congress. And you have new members who are not going to be able to vote, who won't be here until the next Congress. So I think major legislation is probably going to spill over to next year regardless.
So what would you anticipate being kind of the top priorities in Congress with things status quo, meaning president wins, Senate stays, House stays? And then what would you anticipate being top priorities in a Biden administration with a completely Democrat-controlled Congress?
You're talking about next year?
About next year, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I think one issue that's going to eventually get the attention that it has not gotten the last 4 or 5 months, just because of the virus and everything associated with that, is the deficit. I think that's going to be a big issue. We're spending money like it's whatever, I mean, trillion here, a trillion there, and at some point that's going to be a real issue. So that's going to have to be dealt with. And then one issue which I think is a priority for both sides is going to be infrastructure. The president has a proposal and has been out front in talking about the importance of infrastructure and is a commitment to that. So I think we'll see something like that might happen. Biden put out a $2 trillion infrastructure proposal, and I think the Democrats are committed to that. I don't know about a pure stimulus. I don't think if the president gets reelected, I don't think a stimulus will come from a Republican administration, because it has all the bad connotations of stuff that's happened in the past. I'm not sure it even comes from a Democratic administration if their focus is more on infrastructure. Taxes will be an issue one way or the other. I just think it's too early to tell right now. And I've talked to a lot of folks on the Hill. Sometimes, in my position, I always wonder, am I missing something? Am I talking to the right people? Am I not talking enough? But when I end up talking to a lot of people, I find out I know more than they know. And people just don't know at this point. There's just so much up in the air. I know we have some issues that are a concern, and I can mention a few of those. Like,
yeah, example, if you wouldn't mind, certainly the recall issue, I think, is one that always percolates in the back of people's minds. So what happens in a Biden administration with a Democrat Senate?
That's an issue that's obviously very, very important to the members. For years, we have taken the position that we're opposed to any legislation that would prohibit the sale or lease of a motor vehicle that's subject to recall, unless and until that recall remedy has been cured. So we've been opposed to that. This past Congress, only one bill has been introduced by a Democrat. We have worked very closely in the past with Republicans, both in the administration, in Congress. They have been our allies on this issue. So what happens next year? I mean, if it's a Republican president and a Republican administration, I think we stay the course, and hopefully we keep our allies and we fend off any attempts to do something. If it's a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, it's a whole new ballgame. And I'm sure they're going to be very, very aggressive on issues that deal with consumers, and this is one of them. So we are going to have to decide, what our strategy is going to be at that point, and go forward with that.
So last question I'll ask you deals with, and you alluded to it a little earlier, about taxes, and if the vice president wins and the Democrats take control of the Senate, what would you anticipate being done on taxes, and particularly as it relates to President Trump's big tax bill several years ago?
Yeah, well, I think there's going to be an interest in both parties to do something on taxes, only because of the deficit situation. I think they got to look for ways of dealing with that. I see different approaches, though. I mean, I see the Democrats, going after corporate America, going after, high income folks, and, making the argument that it's a middle class, either tax cut or tax increase, whatever they end up doing. I see the Republican, if they're going to do a tax proposal, sort of, chipping at the margins, not necessarily tax margins, but making, changes in various aspects of it, but not a full-blown proposal. I think the bigger effort on the Republican side will be cutting spending, reining that in, as opposed to the focus on the tax side. I see at the Democratic side almost an equal onslaught on the deficit situation, both on cutting spending and increasing taxes and pushing the burden to the quote unquote the wealthy.
Certainly a lot that's going to hinge on what happens on November 3rd. And one thing I'll tell everybody, and we'll have some more conversation about this later in our program this morning, but it's important that everybody votes. I can tell you that NIADA will continue to be active politically through all of this. Our political action committee has been very active in working with members of both aisles, both sides of the aisles. We have supported candidates that are Republicans and supported candidates that are Democrats, but they need to be committed to working with and protecting small businesses and our industry. And I can tell you that the ones that we have supported are that way and will continue to be that way. So Sante, let me thank you for your time today. Thanks for sharing your experience and expertise. We'll continue to monitor the situation between now and November 3rd, and then certainly after November 3rd. And we'll continue to apprise the membership as things change and as we need to activate the grassroots, so to speak. So Sante, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Shaun.